An old family photo from 1885 looks normal, until experts found a hidden hand. In February 2024, the New York Historical Society received an unexpected donation from the estate of Margaret Whitfield, a 94-year-old woman who had passed away in her Brooklyn brownstone, surrounded by generations of family history. Her grandson, Peter, had contacted the museum, explaining that his grandmother's attic contained dozens of boxes filled with photographs, letters, and documents dating back to the 1870s, all meticulously preserved but never properly cataloged or studied. Dr. Lisa Chin, the museum's chief archivist and a specialist in 19th century photography, volunteered to assess the collection. On a cold morning in March, she arrived at the Whitfield brownstone with her assistant, James, and they began the careful process of examining the materials that had been stored in climate-controlled boxes in the attic for decades. The collection was remarkable in its scope and condition. There were daguerreotypes from the 1850s, tintypes from the Civil War era, and cabinet cards from the 1880s and 1890s. Many showed typical scenes of Victorian family life: formal portraits, children in their Sunday clothes, family gatherings, weddings, and funerals. The photographs documented several generations of what appeared to be prosperous New York families, their homes filled with expensive furniture, their clothing reflecting the latest fashions of their respective eras. Among the hundreds of photographs, one particular image caught Lisa's attention immediately. It was a large-format albumen print, professionally mounted on thick cardboard backing, dated 1885 according to a pencil notation on the reverse. The photograph showed a wealthy family posed in an elaborately decorated parlor, a setting that screamed old money and social prestige. The composition was typical of expensive portrait photography from that period. The father, a stern-looking man in his late 40s with a thick beard and expensive three-piece suit, sat in a carved mahogany chair positioned at the center of the frame. His wife, perhaps 10 years younger, stood beside him with her hand resting on his shoulder in the traditional pose of wifely devotion. Their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging in age from approximately 8 to 15, were arranged around their parents in carefully orchestrated positions that conveyed both family unity and social hierarchy. The parlor itself was a showcase of Victorian excess. Heavy velvet curtains with elaborate tassels framed tall windows. Ornate wallpaper covered every visible wall. A massive fireplace with an intricately carved marble mantel dominated one side of the room, and expensive decorative objects, porcelain vases, silver candlesticks, leather-bound books, filled every surface. A large oil painting in a gilded frame hung prominently on the wall behind the family, and a Persian rug covered the polished wooden floor. Everything about the photograph suggested wealth, respectability, and the kind of social standing that came with generations of family money in Gilded Age New York. The family members all wore expensive clothing. The father's suit was clearly custom-tailored. The mother's dress featured elaborate trim and multiple layers of fabric that would have required significant expense, and even the children wore clothing that marked them as members of the city's upper class. But something about the photograph made Lisa pause. She couldn't quite articulate what had caught her attention, but her professional instincts, honed over 15 years of studying historical photographs, told her there was more to this image than initially appeared. Lisa carefully transported the 1885 photograph back to the New York Historical Society's Conservation Laboratory, where she had access to sophisticated digital scanning and enhancement equipment. The photograph was in remarkably good condition for its age. The albumen print showed minimal fading, and the mounting board had protected it from the kind of physical damage that often affected 19th century photographs. Still, there were subtle signs of deterioration, slight discoloration around the edges, a few barely visible spots where the emulsion had degraded, and the inevitable softening of detail that came with 139 years of existence. She placed the photograph on the laboratory's high-resolution flatbed scanner, a piece of equipment capable of capturing images at 4,800 dots per inch, far beyond what the human eye could perceive when looking at the original photograph. The scanning process took nearly 30 minutes, the machine's sensor slowly moving across the surface of the image, capturing every microscopic detail of the albumen print's texture and tonal range. When the scan completed and the resulting digital file appeared on Lisa's computer screen, she spent several minutes simply examining the image at normal magnification, studying the faces of the family members, noting details about their clothing and the room's furnishings. and trying to identify what exactly had triggered her initial sense that something was unusual about this particular photograph. Then she began the process of digital enhancement, using specialized software designed for historical photograph restoration and analysis. She increased the contrast slightly, bringing out details that were barely visible in the original print. She adjusted the brightness and shadow levels, revealing information hidden in the darkest and lightest areas of the image. She applied sharpening filters to enhance edges and fine details that had softened over time or had been slightly blurred by the limitations of 1885 photographic technology. As Lisa worked through these enhancement processes, methodically adjusting various parameters and examining the results, she suddenly noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. In the background of the photograph, on the left side of the frame, there was a doorway partially visible behind the heavy velvet curtains. The door was slightly ajar, creating a narrow gap of darkness between the door and its frame. And in that gap, barely visible in the original photograph but becoming clearer as Lisa enhanced the image, was a hand, a human hand, pale and delicate, with fingers slightly curved as if reaching out or grasping the edge of the door. The hand appeared to belong to someone standing just out of frame, hidden in the darkness of the adjoining room, someone who had not been intended to be part of the formal family portrait. Lisa increased the magnification, focusing specifically on that area of the photograph. As the image enlarged on her screen, more disturbing details became visible. The hand wasn't just pale, it showed signs of injury. There were dark marks across the knuckles that looked like bruising or perhaps burns. The fingers were positioned in a way that suggested tension or pain, not the relaxed posture of someone casually resting their hand on a door frame. Most disturbingly, as Lisa enhanced the contrast even further, she could see what appeared to be scarring or wounds on the visible portion of the wrist, marks that suggested repeated injury or abuse. The hand seemed to be trembling slightly. Even through the stillness that long exposure photography required, there was a barely perceptible motion blur that indicated the person had been shaking, unable to remain completely motionless during the several seconds the camera's shutter had been open. Lisa immediately called her colleague, Dr. Robert Harrison, a historian specializing in Gilded Age New York social history. Robert arrived at the laboratory within an hour, his curiosity piqued by Lisa's cryptic phone message about a disturbing discovery in an 1885 photograph. When she showed him the enhanced image, focusing on the partially visible hand with its signs of injury, his expression shifted from interest to concern. "This hand clearly belongs to someone who wasn't meant to be in the photograph," Robert said, leaning close to the screen. "Someone standing just out of frame, perhaps watching the portrait session, or perhaps trying to signal their presence. The injuries are obvious. This person was suffering, possibly being abused. We need to identify this family and find out who else was living in their household. That hand likely belongs to a servant, probably young given the size and delicacy. Irish or German immigrant most likely, given the demographics of domestic service in 1885 New York." Lisa turned the photograph over, examining the back of the mounting board for any identifying information. The photographer's stamp was clearly visible, embossed in gold lettering. Cornelius & Sons, Fine Photography, 247 Fifth Avenue, New York City. Below that, in faded pencil, someone had written, "The Anderson Family, November 1885. The Anderson name gave them a starting point. Robert immediately began searching through city directories and census records from the 1880s, looking for wealthy Anderson families living in Manhattan during that period. New York in 1885 was experiencing enormous growth and wealth concentration. The Gilded Age was at its height, with industrialists, bankers, and merchants building enormous fortunes and constructing mansions along Fifth Avenue to display their prosperity. After several hours of research, Robert identified a likely match. Charles Anderson, aged 48 in 1885, a successful banker and real estate investor who lived at 428 Fifth Avenue with his wife Eleanor, their 3 children, and a household staff that, according to the 1880 census, included 5 live-in servants. The ages of the children in the photograph matched the ages of the Anderson children as recorded in census data: William, 15, Margaret, 12, and Thomas, 8. Charles Anderson's name appeared frequently in the society pages of New York newspapers from the 1880s. He was described as a prominent member of the city's financial elite, a major donor to various charitable causes, and a respected figure in business circles. The Andersons entertained lavishly, hosted important political figures at their mansion, and were considered one of the better families of New York society, meaning they had both money and the social pedigree that came with multiple generations of wealth and influence. But as Robert dug deeper into the historical record, he began to find hints that the Anderson family's respectable public image might have concealed darker realities. A brief article from 1884 mentioned a lawsuit filed against Charles Anderson by a former employee, though the details were vague and the case appeared to have been settled out of court with no public disclosure of the allegations. Robert's next step was to locate records of the Anderson household's domestic staff. In 19th century New York, wealthy families employed numerous servants, cooks, housemaids, laundresses, butlers, coachmen, and these employees occasionally appeared in various records, census data, employment agency files, immigration documents, and sometimes even newspaper articles if they were involved in crimes or accidents. The 1880 federal census, taken 5 years before the photograph was made, listed the Anderson household staff: Mary Sullivan, Irish, age 42, cook; Patrick O'Brien, Irish, age 38, coachman; Anna Schmidt, German, age 28, housekeeper; Bridget Kelly, Irish, age 19, housemaid; Catherine Murphy, Irish, age 16, scullery maid. Robert focused particularly on the younger servants, Bridget Kelly and Catherine Murphy, as the injured hand in the photograph appeared to belong to someone relatively young based on its size and the smoothness of the skin where it wasn't scarred. He began searching for additional records related to these women, trying to trace what had happened to them after 1880. Bridget Kelly appeared in the 1890 census living in Brooklyn, married with 2 children, apparently having left domestic service to start her own family. But Catherine Murphy seemed to vanish from the historical record after 1880. She didn't appear in the 1890 census, and Robert could find no marriage records, death certificates, or any other documentation of her existence after that single census entry. Expanding his search, Robert looked for employment records from domestic service agencies that operated in New York during the 1880s. Many of these agencies kept detailed files on the servants they placed, including references from previous employers, records of any problems or complaints, and sometimes notes about the servant's character and reliability. In the archives of the Metropolitan Domestic Service Agency, which had placed servants with wealthy Manhattan families from 1870 through 1920, Robert found a file for Catherine Murphy. The file contained several documents that painted a troubling picture. Catherine had arrived in New York from Ireland in 1879, alone and desperately poor, seeking work to support herself in the city. The agency had placed her with the Anderson family in February 1880 as a scullery maid, the lowest position in the household hierarchy, responsible for the dirtiest and most physically demanding work in the kitchen and service areas. The file included a note from 1881, written by the agency director. Received inquiry from Mrs. Eleanor Anderson regarding Catherine Murphy's performance. Mrs. Anderson expressed dissatisfaction with Catherine's work and requested a replacement. However, Mrs. Anderson declined to provide specific details about Catherine's alleged inadequacies. Noted that this is the 3rd servant Mrs. Anderson has requested to replace within 18 months, suggesting possible difficulties in the Anderson household. Another note, dated 1883, was more disturbing. Received visit from Catherine Murphy, who appeared at our office in distressed condition, requesting assistance in finding new employment. She bore visible injuries, bruising on her face and arms, which she claimed resulted from accidents in the Anderson household. When pressed for details, she became frightened and refused to elaborate. Attempted to place her with another family, but she returned to the Anderson household the following day. Suspect she was coerced or threatened into returning. Robert expanded his search into New York newspaper archives, looking for any mention of Catherine Murphy or unusual incidents involving the Anderson household. 19th century newspapers often reported on crimes, accidents, scandals, and legal proceedings involving the city's residents, though coverage was frequently influenced by the social status of those involved. Wealthy families could often suppress or minimize negative publicity through their connections with newspaper publishers and editors. After days of searching through digitized newspaper databases, Robert found a brief article buried on page 9 of the New York Tribune, dated December 3, 1885, just 1 month after the photograph had been taken. The article was only 3 paragraphs long, easy to overlook among the dozens of other minor news items filling the page. Mystery surrounds disappearance of young servant girl. Police are investigating the disappearance of Miss Catherine Murphy, age 21, an Irish immigrant employed as a domestic servant at a residence on Fifth Avenue. Miss Murphy was last seen on the evening of November 28th. Her employer, whose name is being withheld pending investigation, reported her missing on December 1st, claiming the girl had left the household without notice or explanation. However, other servants in the household have told police that Miss Murphy had expressed fear for her safety in the days before her disappearance. Police Inspector Thomas Burns stated that the investigation is ongoing, but that there is currently no evidence of foul play. The timing was significant. Catherine had disappeared just days after the November 1885 photograph was taken, the photograph in which her injured hand was barely visible in the background. Robert felt certain this was more than coincidence. The hand in the photograph might have been Catherine's last appearance in any record, her final attempt to be seen, to leave evidence of her presence and her suffering before she vanished. Robert searched for follow-up articles about the investigation, but found almost nothing. A brief mention 2 weeks later stated that the investigation into the disappearance of servant girl Catherine Murphy has been suspended due to lack of evidence. Police believe the young woman may have left the city voluntarily. The case appeared to have been closed without any real investigation, without anyone being held accountable, without Catherine's fate ever being determined. But Robert did find one more newspaper article, this one from 1887, that suggested the story was more sinister than the official police narrative had indicated. The article appeared in a smaller, more sensationalist publication called the New York Ledger. Former servant speaks of horrors in Fifth Avenue mansion. A woman identifying herself as Mary Connolly, formerly employed as a cook in a prominent Fifth Avenue household, has come forward with disturbing allegations about the treatment of servants in the home of a wealthy banking family. Mrs. Connolly, who left the household's employment in 1886, claims that young female servants were subjected to brutal physical abuse by both the master and mistress of the house. She specifically referenced the case of a young Irish girl named Catherine Murphy, who, according to Mrs. Connolly, suffered terribly and spoke often of her fear before she disappeared under mysterious circumstances in late 1885. Mrs. Connolly states that she attempted to report these allegations to police at the time but was dismissed and warned not to spread slanderous lies about her betters. The family in question, whose name we cannot print for legal reasons, has declined to comment on these accusations. Robert was determined to find more information about Mary Connolly and her allegations. The 1887 article had mentioned she was formerly employed as the Anderson family cook, and Robert suspected she might be the same Mary Sullivan who had appeared in the 1880 census, possibly having changed her surname after leaving the household, either through marriage or deliberately to distance herself from her time with the Anderson family. Searching through immigration records, marriage certificates, and city directories, Robert eventually located information suggesting that Mary Sullivan had indeed married a man named Patrick Connolly in 1884 and had continued to work for the Anderson family for 2 more years before finally leaving their employment in 1886, just months after Catherine Murphy's disappearance. Finding more direct testimony from Mary Connolly proved challenging, as she appeared to have left New York sometime in the late 1880s. However, Robert discovered something unexpected and invaluable. In the archives of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, an organization founded in the 1870s that sometimes also documented cases of abuse against vulnerable adults, including domestic servants, he found a deposition given by Mary Connolly in January 1886. The deposition had been taken by a social reformer named Elizabeth Blackwell, who was investigating conditions for domestic servants in wealthy New York households. Mary's testimony was detailed and deeply disturbing. "I worked in the Anderson household for 6 years, from 1880 until early 1886. I witnessed terrible things during that time, things that haunt me still. The master and mistress of that house treated their servants, especially the young girls, with unspeakable cruelty. Catherine Murphy was perhaps 16 when she first came to work there in 1880. She was a sweet girl, innocent and hardworking, trying to send money back to her family in Ireland. From the beginning, Mrs. Anderson seemed to take particular displeasure in Catherine. She would find fault with everything the girl did, would scream at her for the smallest mistakes, would punish her by withholding food or forcing her to work through the night without rest. But the physical abuse was worse. I saw Mrs. Anderson strike Catherine across the face multiple times for allegedly breaking a dish. I saw her burn Catherine's hands with hot water as punishment for not scrubbing pots quickly enough. The girl's hands were often covered in burns and scalding marks. Mr. Anderson's abuse took different forms. He would corner Catherine in hallways or empty rooms, would touch her inappropriately, would make threatening comments about what would happen to her if she complained to anyone. I tried to protect the girl as best I could, but I was only a servant myself, with no real power in that household. When I suggested to Catherine that she should leave, find employment elsewhere, she told me she was too frightened. She said Mr. Anderson had threatened that if she tried to leave or spoke to anyone about what was happening, he would have her arrested as a thief and sent to prison. She believed him. We all knew that wealthy men like Charles Anderson could make such threats reality through their connections to police and courts. The testimony continued. In November of 1885, something changed. Catherine seemed more desperate, more frightened than ever before. She told me that Mr. Anderson's advances had become more aggressive, that she feared he intended to violate her in the worst way. Mary Connolly's deposition included a crucial detail about the day the family photograph was taken. I remember when the photographer came to the house in November 1885. It was a major event. Mrs. Anderson had been planning it for weeks, having new dresses made for herself and the children, ensuring the parlor was decorated perfectly for the portrait. All of us servants were ordered to stay completely out of sight during the photographer's visit. Mrs. Anderson was obsessed with presenting the perfect image of family respectability and refinement. Catherine was supposed to be working in the kitchen that afternoon, well away from the parlor where the photograph was being made, but I saw her slip out of the kitchen and move toward the parlor. I think she was trying to see what was happening, or perhaps she was trying to be seen, to have her presence documented somehow. She positioned herself near the doorway, just out of the photographer's direct view, but close enough that if someone looked carefully, they might notice her there. I saw her hand reach toward the door frame, saw her standing in that darkened doorway watching the family pose for their portrait. Her hands were badly injured at that time, fresh burns from that very morning when Mrs. Anderson had punished her for some trivial offense, forcing her to plunge her hands into scalding water. The poor girl's hands were raw and painful, and she was trembling from shock and pain even as she stood there watching the photography session. I don't think the family noticed her presence during the photograph. They were focused on holding their poses, on looking dignified and prosperous for the camera. But Catherine was there, bearing witness to their performance of respectability while she suffered their abuse, her injured hands a testament to the violence that existed behind the facade they were creating for posterity. The deposition continued with Mary describing what happened in the days after the photograph was taken. Catherine became more agitated after that day. She told me she couldn't continue living in that house, that she needed to escape before something even worse happened to her. I tried to help her make plans to leave safely, to find another position or perhaps passage back to Ireland. But before we could arrange anything, she vanished. On the evening of November 28, 1885, I was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Catherine was supposed to be helping me, but she had been called upstairs by Mr. Anderson, ostensibly to move some furniture in his study, though I feared his true intentions. I heard raised voices from upstairs, heard what sounded like a scuffle or struggle, and then silence. When I went looking for Catherine later that evening, she was nowhere to be found. Her few belongings were still in the tiny servant's room she shared with Bridget, but Catherine herself had disappeared. I asked Mr. and Mrs. Anderson where Catherine had gone. They told me she had quit without notice, had simply walked out of the house that evening in a fit of ingratitude and irresponsibility, but I didn't believe them. Catherine would never have left without her belongings, without saying goodbye to me, without taking the small amount of wages she had saved. Something terrible had happened to her. I was certain of it. Mary Connolly's deposition described her attempts to get police to investigate Catherine's disappearance. I went to the police station 3 days after Catherine vanished. I told them everything: the abuse, the threats, the suspicious circumstances of her disappearance. The officer who took my statement seemed sympathetic at first, writing down everything I said. But when I told him the family's name, the Anderson family of Fifth Avenue, his demeanor changed immediately. He told me to be very careful about making accusations against respectable citizens, that wealthy and prominent families like the Andersons could sue me for slander, could have me arrested for making false reports, could destroy my life with a single complaint to the right authorities. He said that a servant girl leaving her employment without notice was not unusual, that young immigrant girls were often flighty and irresponsible, and that there was no evidence that any crime had occurred. I tried to insist, tried to make him understand that Catherine had been murdered, for I was certain by then that she was dead, that Mr. Anderson had killed her either deliberately or accidentally during one of his violent assaults, and that the family had concealed her body and made up the story about her leaving voluntarily. But the officer refused to investigate. He actually warned me that if I continued to spread such accusations, I would be the one arrested, not the Andersons. I felt helpless and terrified. I remained in the Anderson household for several more months because I desperately needed the wages, but every day I spent in that house felt like a betrayal of Catherine's memory. Finally, in early 1886, I left their employment and tried to speak publicly about what had happened. That's when I gave this testimony to Miss Blackwell, hoping that someone would finally listen, that someone would seek justice for Catherine Murphy. Robert also found the official police report from the investigation, or rather, the lack of investigation, into Catherine's disappearance. The file was remarkably thin, containing only a few brief documents. The initial missing person report, filed by Charles Anderson himself on December 1, 1885, stated simply, "Our housemaid, Catherine Murphy, left our employment without notice on the evening of November 28th. We assume she has found another position or returned to her family, as young servants sometimes do impulsively. We report her missing only to ensure she has not met with accident or misfortune." A brief statement from Inspector Thomas Burns dated December 5, 1885, concluded, "Investigation into the disappearance of Catherine Murphy reveals no evidence of foul play. The subject appears to have left her employment voluntarily. Several witnesses confirmed seeing a young woman matching her description boarding a train at Grand Central Station on November 29th. Case closed." Robert was immediately suspicious of this conclusion. The witnesses who supposedly saw Catherine at Grand Central Station were never named, or their testimony documented. The investigation appeared perfunctory at best, designed to quickly close the case, rather than genuinely search for a missing young woman. The influence of the Anderson family, their wealth, their social connections, their ability to pressure police and city officials, was obvious in how superficially the case had been handled. Robert continued searching through historical records, looking for any additional evidence about what had really happened to Catherine Murphy. He examined property records for the Anderson mansion at 428 Fifth Avenue, court documents related to the family's business dealings, and even architectural plans of the house that had been filed with the city when renovations were done in the 1880s. One document proved particularly significant: a work order from 1886 for extensive renovations to the Anderson mansion's cellar. The order, filed with a construction company that specialized in foundation work and basement improvements, requested removal and replacement of cellar floor, installation of new drainage system, and structural repairs to foundation walls. The work had been completed in March 1886, just 4 months after Catherine's disappearance. Robert shared this discovery with Dr. Lisa Chen, who immediately understood its potential significance. "If they killed her in that house," Lisa said quietly, "they would have needed to conceal her body somewhere it wouldn't be discovered. The cellar would be an obvious choice. And then 4 months later, they have the cellar floor completely torn up and replaced, destroying any physical evidence that might have been hidden there. They knew they needed to determine what had happened to the Anderson mansion itself." Many of the Grand Fifth Avenue mansions from the 1880s had been demolished in the early 20th century as the city's wealthiest residents moved to new neighborhoods and commercial development consumed the avenue. Research confirmed that 428 Fifth Avenue had indeed been demolished in 1923, replaced by a commercial building that still stood on that location today. Any physical evidence that might have existed, Catherine's remains, if they had indeed been concealed in the cellar, would have been destroyed nearly a century ago during the demolition. There was no possibility of forensic investigation, no chance of recovering physical proof of what Robert and Lisa had become convinced was murder. But they had something else: the photograph. That barely visible hand, reaching out from the darkness, injured and trembling, captured just days before Catherine Murphy vanished. It was the last evidence of her existence, the final testimony to her suffering, and perhaps her deliberate attempt to leave behind proof that she had been there, that she had existed, that what was happening to her was real. Lisa created a detailed forensic analysis of the photograph, using every enhancement technique available to document the injuries visible on the hand, to establish that it belonged to someone who was clearly being abused. and to prove that this person had been present in the Anderson household on the day the family portrait was made. She prepared a comprehensive report including the photograph, Mary Connolly's testimony, the suspicious circumstances of Catherine's disappearance, and the historical context of how wealthy families in Gilded Age New York could literally get away with murder if their victims were poor, immigrant, and socially powerless. In November 2024, exactly 139 years after the photograph was taken and Catherine Murphy disappeared, the New York Historical Society opened a major exhibition titled Invisible Lives: Domestic Servants in Gilded Age New York. The centerpiece was the Anderson family photograph, displayed at large scale with the hidden hand prominently highlighted and annotated, alongside all the historical evidence that Robert and Lisa had compiled about Catherine Murphy's life, abuse, and probable murder. The exhibition drew enormous crowds and extensive media coverage. The story of the hidden hand, a young woman's final attempt to be seen, to leave evidence of her existence before she was erased from history, resonated powerfully with visitors and sparked important conversations about domestic abuse, class inequality, and the countless victims of violence whose stories had been suppressed or forgotten because they lacked social power to demand justice. The exhibition included a memorial wall listing the names of dozens of other domestic servants who had died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances in New York between 1870 and 1900, cases that Robert had discovered during his research. Catherine Murphy's name appeared at the center, finally acknowledged and remembered after nearly 140 years of being erased from official history. Most significantly, the exhibition attracted the attention of genealogical researchers who specialized in tracing Irish immigrant families. A woman named Kathleen Murphy O'Brien, living in Boston, contacted the museum explaining that her great-great-aunt had been named Catherine Murphy, had emigrated from County Cork to New York in 1879, and had disappeared while working as a domestic servant, a family tragedy that had been passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers young Irish women faced in America. Kathleen traveled to New York to see the exhibition, and when she stood before the photograph, before that barely visible injured hand reaching from the darkness, she wept. "My family always knew Catherine had been murdered," she said. "We knew she hadn't just left or abandoned her family, but we had no proof, no evidence, no way to demand justice or even acknowledgement that a crime had been committed. This photograph, this hand, it's proof that she existed, that she suffered, that what happened to her was real. After all this time, Catherine can finally be seen." The exhibition led to renewed interest in the cases of other disappeared domestic servants from the Gilded Age, with historians and genealogists working together to research their stories and honor their memories. The New York City Council passed a resolution formally acknowledging the abuse and violence that domestic servants, particularly young immigrant women, had suffered during the 19th and early 20th centuries, and apologizing for the failure of police and city institutions to protect them or seek justice on their behalf. The Anderson family mansion no longer existed, but descendants of Charles and Eleanor Anderson, respectable citizens who had no personal responsibility for their ancestors' crimes, issued a public statement acknowledging the family's history and expressing sorrow for Catherine Murphy's fate. "We cannot undo the terrible wrongs committed by our ancestors, but we can acknowledge them, remember the victims, and commit ourselves to ensuring that such abuse never happens again." The photograph that Charles Anderson had commissioned in 1885 to document his family's wealth and respectability had become instead a memorial to Catherine Murphy, a young woman whose suffering had been hidden but not entirely erased, whose hand reaching from the darkness had finally been seen, whose story had finally been told. The hand that no one was meant to see had become a powerful symbol of resilience, resistance, and the importance of bearing witness to injustice, no matter how much time has passed or how powerful those responsible may have been. Lisa Chen, standing before the photograph on the exhibition's final day, reflected on what the discovery had meant. Catherine couldn't speak for herself in 1885. She had no legal rights, no social power, no voice that anyone with authority would listen to. But she found a way to leave evidence, to be present in that photograph even when she wasn't supposed to be there. And 139 years later, we finally saw her, we finally listened, and we finally told her story. That's the power of historical evidence and the responsibility of historians, to see the invisible, to hear the silenced, and to ensure that victims like Catherine Murphy are remembered and honored.